Kia ora and welcome back to Chapter 7, where we look at the micro lesson. And the micro lesson has been developed over quite some years now to make the competency space and place as efficient as we possibly can in terms of learning. In other words, it's based on a conceptual architecture, and we unpack that conceptual architecture by first of all seeing that concept through a particular context, and that's stage one. So the whole class will go through that same context, and then we break them up into groups, okay, of 3 to 4, not much more than that if we can possibly help it. 3 to 4 is ideal, to work with each other on another context. So stage one context, everybody. Stage 2, they break into groups and do a different context each, and then present that back to the rest of the class. And this is where we want the learners to eventually take increasing agency. In other words, initially the educator will manage that process. Okay, so you as the educator will manage the process predominantly. Over time, we want to give the learners increasing responsibility over both the first stage of the single context for everybody, and then actually then coming up and doing presentations about their own context. And that second stage there, their own context, can happen quite quickly. Young people in particular love to get up and actually present. They love to be the educator. You know, they look up to you and they immortalize you in many, many ways when they're young, not so much when they get older, but sometimes. So we want to go through this process very briefly with you now. It'll take time and reflection and iteration to get this process right, and each of the schools we've used this with over the years has got a particular iteration of this. So once again, this is not information that came down on stone tablets on a top mountain, in a big mountain. This is some general ideas. You frame it up how you think it should be, but what we want to do is actually keep this nice and tight. The competencies are not 10-week units of work. The competencies are maybe an afternoon and a morning, or a morning and an afternoon. We need to keep the contexts in a very short time frame, because the brain will map contexts if it sees those different contexts in a short space of time. If you do one roundabout today, one in 2 months' time, another one in 2 months' time, another one in 2 months' time, the brain won't see the pattern. It's got to see a number of different contexts after each other, pretty much immediately after each other, to go, oh my goodness, there's a pattern. And you don't have to work on that. Your brain will be doing that silently in the background. It's quite extraordinary. So very quickly, stage one. Eventually you'll get down to this being about a 25 to 35 minute process. Okay. Initially it'll be probably an hour. But with efficiencies and learning and getting used to the process, you'll do that. So we're encouraging you to do a number of these competencies quite soon after each other. Okay, so the competency concepts, move through them, okay, and you might go from starting out, okay, to building confidence, okay, and that might be your limit, okay, with these group of learners. It depends on the age, stage, maturity of the learners themselves. So stage one. Here they goes. So stage one, we select a prompt. Prompts can be anything from objects to events to video clips to using something like epals.com, which is a network of classrooms all around the world. Brilliant place to go for things. Quotes, needs, opportunities, experiments. We can look at images, skits, jokes. You can name it. It doesn't matter. We want a variation in the prompts. The point of the prompt is to engage the learner and get them curious. We want to drive that curiosity, encourage that curiosity, so they see something and go, that's amazing, like, how did that happen? Like, why did they feel like that? Why did she do that? Okay, we want them to feel something, because if they're feeling something, they're learning something. Okay, the brain takes our hormones in our heads, and that gives it a stimulus to say, map this immediately, because it's really exciting. If it's boring, then they're not going to map it at all. Okay? The brain relies on hormones in the head for us to map. The more excited we are, the more quickly they will map those patterns. So we select a prompt. The kids go, that's amazing. So, rightio, have a little reflection time for 2 minutes on what you've just seen or done or experienced, and then we're going to have a conversation with your partners next door in groups of 3 and 4. So they have a reflection, maybe write something down or record something or make some picture notes, etc. Then the third level of this is going and actually then working in groups, exchanging conversation in a group of 3 and 4, collaborating with each other and coming up with an overall architecture of what they think from the 3 or 4 different conversations they've had, and then they share it with the rest of the class very briefly, like 1 or 2 minutes, okay, of share time. Then each group then has 60 seconds to share their outcome as they sort of work that into a presentation of some form. So they want to actually take their conversations, and they have that conversation about the 3 or 4 of them. Then they're going to actually do a little micro lesson themselves where they come up and do a little presentation about what they've done. Okay, and they've got only 60 seconds to do that. So a short skit, a little set of diagrams, so just a picture that they can talk to, but the 3 or 4 come up the front and do that educating process. So we want the learners to take on that educator role, so they become learner educators. And this allows you to sit back and watch and video and record what's going on. Okay. Stage 2 then is about saying to the group, rightio, and for younger groups of learners, we may have to put the contexts up on the board. They may not be able to see or be able to guess or think through what those other contexts could possibly be. By the time they've done 15, 20 or so of these sessions, they get used to that whole notion of what these new contexts mean. Okay, so even with our older learners, they still need some guidance in this space initially. So stage 2, once again, in our groups of 3 and 4 learners, they pick up a different context from stage 1. So in stage 2, we're looking at different contexts for each group. So each group is going to then work on that. We're going to give them 5 to 7 minutes only, you know, and the less time you give them, the more frantic they are, the more focused they are, and the more quickly they come up with this presentation to the rest of the class. So as they've got their 5 to 7 minutes, they've done that, they've got their presentation, they present that to the class. That usually takes 30, 40, 50 minutes to get through a whole class usually, and then they have conversations around the whole of the class around, so what does this mean? What's the pattern that underlines each of these different contexts that we have seen? And then the learners then actually create an artifact to represent their new understanding of that particular concept. So the artifact can be anything from some written, a video, a model. We leave it up to you to actually come up, or them to come up with what they want to, how they want to share their new learning. The learners then share their artifacts with each other, and then the group decides, or the class decides, how will we actually support that new competency that we've just developed. And we've been interested to see some years ago now when the first of students started indicating to each other with hand gestures, you know, the hand gestures, as to whether that competency is being expressed by someone. And if it's a good and being projected very well, the competency, and being applied very well, then they'll go, eyes up, you know, eyes up, yep, right, that's really cool. Okay, no words, just eyes up and thumbs up. That's how it started, and then it was this for another competency, and this for another competency, and that for another competency, and this for another competency, etc. And the learners come up with these things. You don't, they do. They can choose whatever they want to do. And so initially it's only about positive reflections. As they get a bit older, and we're talking about 7, 8, 9 years old, we can have the occasional sort of, no, that's not very good actually, so there's eyebrows down and sort of, you know, no, you know. So they can indicate initially positively, and then when they get to 7, 8 years old, we can start looking at them actually indicating negatively. The trick here is that no one can speak. It is all gesture only. Okay, it's gesture only because people can then get grumpy and start getting angry with each other, especially when they're negative. But just eyes up, yep, great, or yeah, no, don't like that actually, I think you're not doing what you should be doing. What we want here is the learners to take over the management, their self-management of each other, that responsibility. In other words, they become helpers of each other in building capacity. We would like to take you out of that picture as much as possible as an educator. And we think this is great for your sanity and also the practicality of everyday work in a classroom. We want to reduce your demands, the demands on you as an individual, because those demands at the moment are just going through the roof. And personally, I don't think that's very fair. Okay, it's becoming a job that's almost overwhelming. And we want to make it manageable. We want to give more onus on the learners, and that's good for them too, because that builds their agency, it builds their understanding of the learning process, it builds capability for life. Righty, thank you very much, and we'll come back soon with Chapter 8. Thank you.